Hello, everybody. I want to welcome you back to the Old Testament survey course here on video. I also want to wish you a very happy Easter, happy day of celebrating the resurrection of Christ. I hope that you're able to keep up in the course. I think it's fairly simple. So remember, if you have any questions or concerns, feel free to contact me by phone, by email, by text, whatever is most convenient for you. Whatever you do, stay in contact with me. I also want to just draw your attention. There is a PowerPoint presentation at the bottom of this week's topic that you should open up and follow as we go through the lecture together. I believe the title is, Kings, Prophets, and a Divided Kingdom, lecture number 3. Now, this week I want to remind you of something that came up in last week's lecture, and that is that according to Yahweh, kings are a concession to Israel. That is, having a king serve over the entire kingdom of Israel or over all the people of Israel is not God's first intention. As a matter of fact, God desires to simply raise up a leader like Moses or Joshua or Deborah or Gideon, rather than have a sequence of kings from one family. However, because of Israel's rebelliousness and stubbornness, God allows that to take place. And ultimately, he chooses David. Saul's the first king, and he's a great failure. And then he starts over with David, and it's from David that this line of kings emerges. And the only good kings in the Old Testament come from the line of David, and the only good kings are in the kingdom of Judah. And we'll explain that difference here in just a few moments. But right now, if you're looking at the PowerPoint presentation, I want to draw your attention to the arrow illustration, which is the first slide in that presentation. I'm not able to show it on my screen right now because I'm technically incompetent. So look on it for yourselves. But you see an arrow moving to the right. On the far left of the arrow, you see the name of David. Then you see Solomon's name. Then you see divided kings. And the next slide, you see the phrase Yahweh, where the square with David is. And the square with Solomon, you'll see the phrase foreign wives. And then the third one is the phrase polytheism. Now, the point I'm trying to make here with this image of this image of the arrow is that as the kingdom of David passes through time, it passes from this point where it is very devoted and committed to Yahweh as ruler over all, to which is symbolized during the time of David, to a time of polytheism, which is initiated through Solomon, who Solomon begins off as a very wise king. He's the son of David and Bathsheba. But later on, in his attempt to make his kingdom greater and larger, he enters into marriages and relationships with foreign women. Now, it's not that there's anything wrong with foreign women. The problem, however, is that when Solomon marries them, he's no longer remaining faithful to Yahweh, but he's now following their gods as well. And this leads to the kingdom being divided in two, into the northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah. And then it also leads to rampant idolatry or polytheism, which is something that we see coming up throughout all of the book of 1st and 2nd Kings, and also the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which are a counter viewpoint to the stories told in 1st and 2nd Kings. So today we're going to talk about the divided kingdom. We're going to talk about some good kings, some bad kings, and some prophets. The divided kingdom, let me explain how the divided kingdom begins. You can read about this in the first chapters of 1st Kings. First of all, Solomon dies, and he is succeeded by his son Rehoboam. But Rehoboam does something foolish. Instead of listening to the older, wiser people, the men who were associated with his father, he dismisses those wise people, sends them away, and listens only to his young friends. And he rules the people of Israel with an iron fist. And that leads to a rebellion, which is led by a man named Jeroboam, who was also one of King Solomon's right-hand men. So Jeroboam leads one half of the people of the tribe, well, most of the tribes actually. He leads them away to create their own kingdom known as Israel in the north. And then Rehoboam stays in the south around Jerusalem and that is known as the kingdom of Judah. Interestingly enough, and you can see this, there's a map in there that'll show you the difference between the kingdom of Israel, which is situated with its capital as Samaria, and the kingdom of Judah, with its capital as Jerusalem in the south. The kingdom of Israel is larger, stronger, more people, but the kingdom of Judah is where the faithful kings reside. The few faithful kings, only 8 out of 20, reside in the southern kingdom of Judah. Now, idolatry returns with a vengeance whenever the divided kingdom happens, whenever it takes place, because Jeroboam sets up a golden calf in the northern part of the kingdom and also in the southern part of the kingdom. And the key thing that you need to keep in mind is that he is doing this because he's trying to keep the people of Israel from returning to Jerusalem to do their worship. Instead, they can remain within the bounds of this new northern kingdom. Keep this in mind. The divided kingdom is the beginning of the end. Worship of Yahweh, as it occurred under David, was temporary, and idolatry and polytheism will persist, especially in the northern kingdom, until the exile. Now remember, the arrow illustration is there to remind us that under David, the worship of Yahweh was prevalent. Under Solomon, because of his many marriages, he became a polytheist. He worshipped many gods. And then as a result, the kingdom was divided. Now, there are some good kings and prophets for you to keep in mind. In the PowerPoint, I mentioned the prophet Elijah. I urge you to read the stories of the prophet Elijah. They're beautiful, wonderful, exciting, fun, and he is really symbolic of all the great prophets of the Old Testament. Then I mentioned 3 specific good kings: Jehoshaphat, Hezekiah, and Josiah. We're not going to go into detail on them here in the video. We'll talk a little bit more about Hezekiah than the other 2. But the key thing to keep in mind is that these kings promote the reading of the law, the Torah, and the keeping of the Torah, and the keeping of all of the religious rituals that the people of God, the children of Jacob, are supposed to follow. Now, the prophet Elijah lived in the northern kingdom, did all of his ministry up there, and his primary nemesis during his time of ministry and serving in the northern kingdom was King Ahab, not from the novel Moby Dick, but from the Bible, his namesake. And not only Ahab, but Ahab's wife, Jezebel. The prophet Elijah was a fascinating man, kind of a wild man who lived out in the desert, and he looked very much like the figure of John the Baptist that we read about in the New Testament. As a matter of fact, John the Baptist is considered a kind of Elijah, or a type of Elijah. Around Elijah, he created a company of prophets, or a school of prophets. He fought against he fought against Ahab and Jezebel and their introduction of Baal worship. And Elijah is one of 2 people in the Old Testament who supposedly never died. As a matter of fact, he was taken away in a chariot of fire. And the mantle of his leadership, that is the cloak that symbolized his prophetic ministry, he placed around his protege, whose name is Elisha. So it's easy to get those 2 guys confused. Now, I want to mention one thing. In the book of Matthew chapter 17, Jesus goes up on top of a mountain in the northern part of Israel. And while he's up there with his disciples, he is transfigured and he glows white. And there are 2 figures next to Elijah in that moment in Matthew chapter 17. One of those 2 figures is Moses. The other one is Elijah. Now, Moses is there. Moses represents the law, the Torah. Elijah represents the prophets. So that the law and the prophets, Jesus is consistent in his ministry with the law and the prophets. Just a quick thing to keep in mind here. And of course, God's voice overshadows that moment and says, "This is my son, listen to him." And the disciples are totally freaked out, as one should be. It seems like only an appropriate response to such an event. Now, moving on. Let's a few quick notes on the northern kingdom. The capital city of the northern kingdom of Israel was called Samaria. Israel is the name of the northern kingdom, but it's easy to get confused here because prior to it being the northern kingdom, it also represents the united kingdom that ruled under David. In the prophetic writings, the northern kingdom is also referred to as Ephraim, or the people of Ephraim. In 722 BCE, the Assyrian Empire wiped out the northern kingdom of Israel, and the Assyrians deported the people of the northern kingdom throughout the Assyrian Empire. And that was the end, essentially, of that northern kingdom. And that's one date that we really need to pay attention to in this class, and that's the year 722 BC. Now, King Hezekiah comes around in the 8th century, the year 715 to 686 BCE. These are his dates. He ruled in the southern kingdom of Judah. Isaiah and Micah both were prophets during his reign. Hezekiah mandated the worship of Yahweh alone. And when the Assyrians were laying siege to Jerusalem, it was Hezekiah and his leadership and his listening to God that kept them alive. Hezekiah was considered a wise king, a good king, a righteous king. He also built a tunnel known as the Siloam Tunnel, which you can go to today in Jerusalem, and there's a picture of it in the slides. But the Siloam Tunnel is a fascinating place. It was a water channel underneath the ground. I encourage you to look it up on Wikipedia or something and check out and read the story about how it was created. It really is miraculous. The last thing to keep in mind about King Hezekiah, and this is an unfortunate reality, he had a son named Manasseh who succeeded him as king, and Manasseh ruled in Judah longer than any other king, and Manasseh was the most evil of kings to ever rule on the throne. We'll discuss him here in a couple of moments. As I mentioned before, Manasseh is a really, really bad king. He was a co-regent with Hezekiah for a short time, but after his father died, his reign was marked by idolatry and child sacrifice and absolute prurience in immorality. Some of the idols that were worshipped during the time of Manasseh in Judah were Baals, Asherah. He worshipped the stars, and he worshipped the god Molech. And of course, we know about Molech because Molech is the god that the ancient Ammonites and Moabites would worship, and they would conduct human sacrifice. They would sacrifice infants and children to Molech. He also placed an idol of Asherah in the temple in Jerusalem. Just unexpectedly horrible behavior. Now, 2 Kings 21 records Manasseh's end, the end of his rule, and records it rather abruptly. He was an evil king. Nobody ever did anything as bad as him, and then he died. That's kind of how the story is told. But 2 Chronicles gives us a different accounting of King Manasseh. First of all, in 2 Chronicles 33, it says that he was taken into Babylon by the Assyrians, and that they put a hook in his nose and dragged him off. And while he is in Babylon, under the rule of the Assyrians, he prays to God and is repentant. And because of his repentance, he returns back to Jerusalem and undertakes a lot of a variety of reforms that are good for the people of Jerusalem. And this leaves this fascinating question. Why does 2 Kings tell us one story and 2 Chronicles tell us another? One more thing that I want you to do is I want you to look up in your Oxford Bibles the prayer of Manasseh. Look it up in the table of contents. It is a psalm that's found in the Apocrypha. And read the prayer of Manasseh. It's beautiful. There's one line in it that Manasseh supposedly prays, and he says, "And now I bend the knee of my heart." That is, Manasseh has been completely humiliated, humbled, abused, and beaten by the Assyrians. But when he repents before God, he says he bends the knee of his heart, not just his physical knees. So this is a great mystery in Scripture, and I think what it tells us is that the story of Manasseh, repenting, is actually foreshadowing the story of Israel going into captivity in Babylon, and then after repenting there, they now return back to Jerusalem. But that is a story for next week, for next week's discussion about exile. King Josiah follows after Manasseh, I think 2 kings after him. He reintroduces the Torah and the Passover. It's another beautiful story. He destroys the idols that were being worshipped by the previous kings. And it's also interesting to note that King Josiah was prophesied about, that he would be the king who would deliver them. Now I want to finish our time by talking about the prophets, and I especially want to mention the prophet Isaiah. And you're going to be watching 2 videos about Isaiah this week. So I urge you to watch those videos, learn a little bit about Isaiah. It's a very long, somewhat complex book, but it's also a really beautiful book, a very hope-filled book, in spite of the tone throughout it. Now, I want you to keep this in mind. The good kings that existed in Judah, such as Jehoshaphat, Hezekiah, Josiah, and there are a few others. The reason that they are good kings is because they responded to God like David did. David did a lot of bad things, but ultimately David was responsive to Yahweh. He responded with a heart after God. Now, the good kings that we read about in 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles are responsive to God because largely they respond to God through the warnings that the prophets bring them. The prophets such as Isaiah, and Micah, and of course, as we mentioned earlier, the prophet Elijah, who is really the prototypical prophet of Scripture. So it's critical that the kings respond to the leadership of the prophets. Now, real quickly, the 3 main prophets that you need to know about in this class are Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And you can look these guys up in the PowerPoints. You're also reading about them in the Bible. But Isaiah, I want you to keep this in mind. Isaiah is the prophet before exile. Jeremiah is the prophet at the moment of exile. And Ezekiel is the prophet during or in the exile. Isaiah lived during the 700s, during the 8th century. He prophesied during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. He prophesied about the northern kingdom and about the southern kingdom. Now, the book of Isaiah is a fascinating literary combination. It's probably not one book, but 3 books that have been compiled together. We won't go into too much detail there, but I want you to understand that when you read a prophetic book like the book of Isaiah, it's going to be a combination of genres or types of literature. It is going to include prose, that is, historical accounts of what's going on. It's going to include a lot of what appears to be poetry, and that's because the prophetic words are often placed in parallel lines, poetic lines. And of course, the book of Isaiah historically covers the Assyrian crisis when Israel's hauled off and deported by the Assyrians, the Babylonian crisis when the people of Judah are taken into exile, and then it includes the aftermath of the exile and how Israel returns to the land. Some of the themes of Isaiah are the sovereignty of God, monotheism, the worship of Yahweh alone. Another theme that's really neat, I think, is that it describes a new exodus. Similar to the exodus out of Egypt, Isaiah describes an exodus out of the sinfulness and idolatry and faithlessness of the people of Israel. And then lastly, it introduces us to a character known as the servant of God, which really is an introduction to the person of Christ who's going to appear in the New Testament. With that in mind, keep this fact in your thoughts. Jesus quotes Isaiah 8 different times, and overall, Isaiah is cited 85 different times in the New Testament in 61 different passages. And sometimes it's called the Old Testament Gospel or the Gospel of the Old Testament. There are many key passages, and I would like you to pay close attention to these passages, and you can review these in the PowerPoint. But these passages, I identify several different things. Number one, they talk about the servant of God, the messianic figure, whom we come to assume is Christ himself. It also discusses this concept of covenant faithfulness. Now, covenant faithfulness means that Israel is to live according to the covenant that's revealed in the book of Deuteronomy, and that's revealed to the people of Israel in the Torah. Now, if they live by that covenant, they're going to continue to be God's priests to the nations. And Isaiah, that's a theme, by the way, that Isaiah repeats over and over again. So this notion of covenant faithfulness has to do with Israel serving the purpose that they were called to in Exodus 19:6. If you keep my covenant and obey my commandments, you will be for me a priestly nation. You'll be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So those are some of the, there's several more important passages in there. It even talks about how Cyrus, who is the leader of the Persians, is God's anointed worker to accomplish what God wants done. And there's so many other great passages for you to pay attention to. In addition, as you look at the PowerPoint and as you listen to this lecture and as you do your readings and watch the videos, I encourage you to look at the maps in the PowerPoint. Those might help you as you try to get a grasp on this material. Now, keep this in mind as we wrap up. As we found out last week, kings are a concession for Yahweh. It's not his original plan. But now that the people of Judah and the people of Israel have anointed for themselves kings, the goal of these kings is to operate by covenant faithfulness. That is, they are to be responsive to God. They are to keep the people from idolatry, and they are to continue maintaining the covenant that they've been given. And if they do this, and if they respond to the word of the prophets that comes to them, God is going to work with them and bless his nation. But as you noticed at the end of the first and second Kings video, or as you will notice once you watch it, at the very end of the story of Second Kings is this disaster of exile. Just this horrible result of the behavior of the people of Israel. But there's just a glimmer of hope that God is going to come back and rescue them. And we're going to discuss the exile and the rescue next week when we get together. I hope this is a good week for you, learning and reading. And if you've not been turning in your summaries of the videos, I encourage you to do so. I won't count them late as long as I get them here before I'll give you a final date. But make sure that you get those lectures to me, or those summaries rather, to me. Take care. Have a great week. Stay safe. Cough into your elbow. Go to the doctor if you feel sick. All that stuff your parents would tell you. Please take care of yourselves, and may God bless you.